Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to briefly review with you Biblical Hebrew, this particular grammar and syntax, as far as it's going to relate to our exegesis class. Now, each week, your responsibility is to try to add to your Hebrew learning, regardless of whether you feel like you're fairly well versed in Hebrew or barely remember anything that you learned. The critical piece is going to be your attitude, gaining better use of Hebrew so that you can use it to become the profound, the inspiring, the compelling interpreter that our world desperately needs. We need people that can dig into the scriptures in Hebrew for the Old Testament, along with Aramaic to some extent, and Greek for the New Testament, critical skills that allow us to dig deeply into the scriptures. Again, if you just want to stick a toe in, you don't need it. But I'm guessing that everyone in this class wants to get really deep into the Word, and biblical languages are a tool that helps us to do that. So with that said, let me talk about a couple things that we need to have access to. Make sure you have access to a Hebrew Bible, often called the BHS, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. That's our critical edition of the Masoretic textual tradition. You can also use an electronic version of this, so you don't just have to have the hard copy. You can have it electronic, and you want to be able to have access to the parsing, so you can either use sight reading or use tools to gain access to the parsing, so that then you can then break it down. And the book that we're going to use for doing our grammatical syntactical analysis is going to be the book by Arnold Choi. Some of you may have used it in OT 501. Some of you may not have. This is a critical book that takes us the next step. If you learn basic grammatical forms and some functions in OT 501, what we want to do in exegesis is help you to understand how those basics give frameworks for how the Hebrew authors are going to bring meaning. Right? So that's what syntax does. Syntax is a study of the function of verbs, nouns, all the different elements of speech within the context of a sentence. And so in this book, A Guide to Biblical Hebrew Syntax, Bill Arnold and John Choi, and Bill Arnold teaches on the Wilmore campus still. They have broken down the various categories of grammar and syntax, and then laid out the different possibilities and nuances that you can see in each piece. So I'll come back to how we're going to use this book in a minute, but this is going to be the book that you have to use its categories to be able to do the grammatical analysis for our class. Now, also as backup, just for basic stuff about Hebrew, you want to have handy your Cook-Homestead Beginning Biblical Hebrew textbook. As well as for our work, you want to have access to several biblical translations. And if you're an English speaker, that would going to be English translations. I recommend the ones that are more formal equivalent, like the ESV, the NASB. You can also use the New Revised Standard and the NIV. You want to have different families of texts so you can see how different scholarly committees, when they're making translations, how they have taken decisions on the meaning of the Hebrew. Now, I do want to mention a key page in the Cook-Homestead book, because there's the problem that we're going to face with Arnold Choi is Bill Arnold and John Cook, though they're on the same faculty here at Asbury, they don't use the same terminology to describe the grammar. And so a critical piece is going to be Appendix E. It's page A50. Page A50 of Cook-Homestead gives it translates the language that Cook and Homestead use in their book with how traditional Hebrew grammarians have used it, and which is what Arnold and Choi's book is. For example, you've learned the phrase benyan or benyanim for like the call, the hifil, the pil. In Arnold Choi, they're going to call it stems, the verbal stem, right? Another example would be past narrative as a particular type of verb. In Arnold Choi, it's going to be the imperfect plus VOV consecutive. I'll say something more about that in a minute. So these are the resources that you're going to need. And again, why we're going to use several English translations, or if you're a Spanish speaker, feel free to use a Spanish translation along with some English translations, is you want to be able to see different nuances. So how the Hebrew can be put into different types of translations. It's the same Hebrew word, but sometimes the English translations are going to disagree substantively, not just in terms of being synonyms, but in terms of actually taking Hebrew words and making them have a different nuance. Okay, and we'll say more about that as we go through the class. So for our class, what do you need to know for Hebrew? Well, if you want to get good at Hebrew, you need to learn vocabulary, you need to learn some grammar, and you need to practice reading, right? So I encourage you to continue to work through the vocabulary that you learned in your beginning Hebrew class. But the parts of speech that we're going to focus on for this class is we're going to look at nouns, verbs, prepositional phrases or prepositions, and particles. And if you look at the table of contents for the Arnold Choi book, you'll see that the table of contents is organized around these. Now, again, you might say, well, geez, what have you left off? Well, I've left off a few things, right? But so I'm going to give you some specifics that I'm going to have you want to look at and gain a familiarity with. So for example, with nouns, nouns are fairly straightforward. Essentially the nouns, and this is a traditional language, they're either absolute or they're construct. This is what Cook and Homestead, this is the bound state in their particular textbook, their way of talking about it, the bound form. And Arnold Choi are also going to talk about this as genitive. So if you look up your table of contents and look up nouns, you're going to see that nouns can function as subjects, as objects, sometimes indirect objects, and they can also be in the genitive. And so when we're analyzing nouns, for the most part, you're going to be analyzing a noun, you're going to describe it, but with the parsing, and then you're going to just talk about what's its function in the sentence. So it's the subject, or it's the object. Or if it's in this bound state, you're going to go through the categories in Arnold Choi and describe the relationship between the words. So, for example, with the genitive, if you have Hebrew words that two Hebrew words that are in the bound state, let's say that we have something like Lev, Zahav. And this is bound with this one, so we have a relationship. This would literally be heart of gold. We would look through the categories in the genitive to try to describe what's the relationship between the word gold with the word heart. That's the kind of analysis that we're going to do. So you'd go to Arnold Choi, you look up genitive, and you would walk through the different categories until you found the type of word here. And in this case, this looks a lot like gold is giving an attribute of the word heart. It's essentially functioning like an adjective in this case. That's just one example. Again, we'll come back to these, but that's the kind of analysis that we're going to want to do with nouns. And the second thing with verbs, we're going to look at verbs, and I'm going to come back to the verbs. I'm going to erase the board and go over some specific things. So I'm going to leave verbs for last because I can explain prepositions in a fairly straightforward way. All the prepositions show up in 4.1 in the Arnold Choi book, and you have a list of them. And I'm putting prepositional phrases because what you're going to analyze whenever you come with a Hebrew preposition, and you know some of them, words like the easy ones are like bait, or we have the lamed, or even the kaf. Those are some of the most common prepositions. They're attached. The word they're attached to is going to be what? It's going to be the object of the preposition. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to look up in Arnold Choi 4.1 and you'll actually find an entry for the most common prepositions. So when you find a preposition in your Hebrew text and you want to figure out what's the force of it, what's the meaning of it, because you remember, when you learn bait, lamed, and kaf for a vocabulary quiz, like the bait, what did you learn bait meant? It can be in, it can be with, it can be by, it can be against, it can pretty much be almost anything, right? Well, what does it mean specifically in a context, and what's the connotation? What's the connotation of it meaning with in one place over against in, or on, or by, or against? Those all have a different grammatical category. So you can look up bait in 4.1 and see the different meanings the bait can have. And you want to then figure out every time you run into a bait in a sentence, what's its force? See, this is why we learn grammar. So we can begin to break it down and ask ourselves, what is the meaning of in? What's the, in other words, like think about if I could say, we are in Christ. I could say, I put my food in a refrigerator. I'm deep in joy. The connotation of in each of those places is slightly different, right? In some cases, it's a spatial kind of a thing. I'm going into something. Other words, it's more metaphorical, like being in Christ, right? So that makes sense. And so when we do grammatical analysis, we're going to be asking ourselves, what's the particular flavor or force of these grammatical pieces? So the prepositional phrase, you'll analyze it by taking the preposition. So it's the preposition plus its object, which is going to be a noun, right? So we'll analyze that whole piece. And so when you analyze a preposition, you are by nature analyzing its relationship to its object. And so you've done both of those things. So the noun's the object, and the force of the preposition gives you the meaning of the prepositional phrase. Again, with all of this, you're going to notice in our course center that I have a sample of Exodus chapter 1, verse 6 and 7, where you can see specific examples of this. You're going to want to go over that video as well. Have your Arnold Choi book handy so you can see this in action with real text. But again, this is just an introduction to what we're going to be doing. Now, particles are the same as prepositions. Particles are words that, again, that link phrases, clauses together, and you can look them up in the Arnold Choi book to get a sense of what their force is going to be. Now, let me erase this and go to the most complicated part of the grammatical analysis stuff, which is going to be verbs. And I know just from the fact that you've had OT 501, and that was sort of a blitz through the grammar, that this can be a difficult piece. Now, when we analyze verbs, we need to look at verbs in essentially two ways. We want to look at verbal type, and we're also going to look at the stem or the binion, as you learned in Cook-Homestead. And so I will talk about that with you now. Now, types of verbs. Perfect, imperfect, past narrative, and these are going to be your main types of verbs, but there's some additional ones that are going to show up. Things like participles. We're going to have infinitives. There's two types of infinitives. There's just infinitives and there's adverbial infinitives. This is where, again, Cook-Homestead, Arnold Choi are different. This is one place. This is called, the past narrative is called the imperfect plus Vav consecutive. This is 3.5.1. So please note this, that whenever you find a past narrative, it's an imperfect VOV consecutive, and it's critical to distinguish these two from each other. They're not the same thing. An imperfect is not an imperative, and imperfect is not an imperfect plus VOV consecutive. So you have to distinguish between these two types. This will be a common mistake, but we're going to get that nailed down in this class. But make sure you notice the past narrative has a different name in Arnold Choi. It's an imperfect plus VOV consecutive. By the way, this is the most common type of verb in Hebrew narrative. So you're going to see it over and over again in the Hebrew text. And then back to participles, infinitives. This is called infinitive constructs in Arnold Choi. And the adverbial infinitives are called infinitive absolutes. Then you also have a series of verbal types that are used more as commands. This would include jussive, cohortative, and imperative. Now, when you're completing a grammatical analysis assignment, you want to make sure that you identify a verb by its verb type, and then look up these categories in Arnold Choi and select the category that fits the context. Again, you can see the example for how that's done, but make sure you're going to identify two things. You're going to do this, then you're going to give the category from Arnold Choi, and then you're going to go to the stem or binyan and analyze the stem. So again, these are the verbal types. Now, when we talk about stems and binyans, let me show you what that looks like. And depending on the semester you were in and your teacher, you would have worked on these lesser or maybe more than other types. So let me show you the different verbs, and I'll show you how they're put together. You have call, Pl, Hifil, sometimes known as the G stem, the D stem, because there's a doubled second radical or second letter, and this is the H stem. Then we have Nifl. We have the Pual. We have Hofel. And this gets called the N. This is the binyan. It has a noon at the front of it. The Pual is a doubled stem with a passive voice, and Hofel is an H with a passive. And so these get organized by the voice. And so call, Pl, Hifil are active. This is passive. In that case, the subject is acted upon by the verb versus being the actor. And then there's a middle reflexive tense as well. And this can also be the nifal. So a nifal can either be passive or middle reflexive. And how would you know the difference? It's going to be context. For the Pl, Pual, and Hifal, we have this other type of the verb called the Hifpael. Which gets with the abbreviation, it has a hey, tav, and then a doubled second radical. So this gets called the HTD stem. And then there are some additional reflexive stems for the Hifil, Hofil that we won't talk about because they're fairly rare. But these are the main binyans that you'll work with when you're studying Hebrew. And this will cover the vast majority of occurrences. Now, what's the difference going across? Again, what's critical is to look at Arnold Choi to see what each of these types can mean. And I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about. First of all, the key difference is going to be the type of action. And once you get over here, this has to do with causation. There's a little bit of a sense of causation implicit here, whereas like the subject is acting upon an object to put it into a certain state. And so these have to do with causation, and we'll say more specifically about these functions once we start doing the grammatical analysis, but that's kind of the idea. Whereas this is just a sort of normal action, descriptive action, talking about stative verbs, or just basic action like I was running, or he was great in these cases. So the difference between this column and over here is going to be the causal nature of these stems. Now, that's in theory. Now, here's what you got to remember, and I'll have to say this a couple times in the class as well. The stems are exegetically significant when a particular word can be deployed in multiple stems. And you can do this by looking at a lexicon. So like, let's say you have a verb, you look it up, and it always just happens in one of these stems. It's not so much exegetically significant, but let's say you have a word, like, for example, the word Gadol. He was great. You're going to find this in various stems. And so then at that point, it becomes exegetically significant. And so when you come across a verb that when in its in the lexicon it happens in more than one stem, then you can actually see what the nuance is between the stems. And this is where this causation materials come into play. So what you want to do, whenever you find a verb, you're going to identify it by its verbal type. So for example, perfect. Look up perfect in Arnold Choi. What's the function of the perfect here? What are the, out of the couple options that are there? And then also, let's say we have a perfect PL. Okay, what's the force of the PL? So you're going to look up and decide in the context that you're studying, what's the force it's going to take on. Now, when you're looking for categories and trying to figure out what something means, this is where, if you're not great at Hebrew, looking at various English translations can help you, because what you want to look at is what's the force of the language as it comes from Hebrew into English or into Spanish or into Creole or into French, and can you pick up the nuance from looking at the translations? And this is where comparing translations can help, because sometimes the translations are going to differ on the force, and you can note that in your grammatical analysis. Again, this is just an introduction, and so I know that in some ways I've hopefully illuminated some things, but I'm going to guess you're also going to have some questions. Now, go ahead and review the next video where I do the sample of Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, and see if that helps to clarify. But what you're going to see is I'm going to go through the elements that I talked about in this video. I'm going to look at Arnold Choi, and I'm going to describe the grammar and give the categories out of Arnold Choi that make the best sense of how the grammar is functioning in this context. Again, I'm Brian Russell. It's great to have you in class, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.